Hi, I'm Mark Forsythe. I'm a member of the British Columbia Historical Federation Council. And prior to that, I was working at CBC Radio in British Columbia for about 30 years. And it was my good fortune to have the opportunity to, over that time, interview Michael Kluckner many times. Michael, of course, is an artist, a writer, historian, a heritage advocate. But back in BC Almanac days, when I was hosting that program, he launched a project called Vanishing British Columbia. And he called it kind of a roadside memory. And Michael had a really good head start traveling around the province for many years with his sketchbook and his watercolors and documenting these places, whether they be homes, cafes, motels, churches, even places of internment along our province's rural roads. And then he asked CBC listeners to share some of their own memories of these disappearing buildings and spaces. And Vanishing British Columbia is the result. And here is a copy of this beautiful book from UBC Press. And we're going to welcome Michael today to take us on a tour, really. And I guess it's quite appropriate in times of COVID-19 to travel this way around the province. And welcome. It's great to have you here with us today, Michael.
Yeah, great to be back with you, Mark, like the old days on CBC.
Yes, and this started for you kind of as a web-based project where you put material on the web and you asked people to contribute. And what were you looking for at that time?
Well, it was partly the idea that when you're traveling and you're out in the country, there is no archive that is nearby. There is no museum. There is no place that you can go to very, very easily and find out about details. And if you live in a rural area for a long time, then you get to know somebody who knows somebody who will remember or will know where documents are. And I was looking at this, just basically thinking, how will I ever find out about these places? And at this time, it's in the late 1990s, and I'm beginning to think that I should put up a website as an artist. And then just around that time, the Google search engine is invented. And people begin to go online as they come along, and they're interested in genealogy, and they might have remember that Granddad worked in a place called North Bend, and they would type North Bend in. And in a lot of these small places, it would come up with my website very quickly. And before
wasn't a lot written about North Bend at the time, was there?
Well, but I would have some pictures up there, but I would be effectively asking people for information. And so I would began to get photographs from people out of their private collection. I began to get stories from them, and then one thing begat another thing begat another thing. And in some cases, these extraordinary spin-offs and people writing from around the world and adding in that level of detail into my website as if it's in some way a kind of an uncurated museum. And you think of this at the time we're going into the 2000s where there's some pretty sharp government cutbacks, a lot of which are affecting the small museums and so on. And there was also the depopulation of much of the British Columbia interior and small towns as people, particularly young people, are leaving for jobs. And so there's, in a way, it all came together around old-fashioned rural things, and then also this unlikely combination of technology. And I was thinking, as I'm always thinking about, well, how can this go together into a book? And well, it could have just been a book of paintings and said, well, this is a place I came upon on the roadside. But it turned out to have all this kind of historical depth to it. But one thing that I want very much to get across to people who are watching and listening is that this isn't unique to me in any way, and it's an indication of how a project that starts off can continue to grow and grow and grow. And so Vanishing British Columbia on the web, on my website, is probably 4 times as big as anything that could have gone into the book. And one of the things that I want to show people is just what was coming in and when it came in and how it indicated really what I was doing. And so this marvelous kind of ongoing way of getting into rural British Columbia at a time when we're very, very focused on cities. We're very focused on tech. We're focused on supposedly on the future, but here is the past, and people remembering, and that idea of telling stories is just so important.
Yes, still has so much meaning for so many people. Well, let's begin your roadside memory tour, and you're going to take us to many different parts of the province over the next few minutes here. So, whenever you're ready.
So here we go. This is the kind of web page key that you would see if you went onto my website. And just to give you an idea of the process that I was going through as I began this project, this was the image that really got me started thinking that I should do something. We were traveling across the south of the province on Highway 3 in 1995, heading, I think, to Cranbrook. And along the way, beautiful day, pulled off to the side of the road, and there was an old ranch sitting down, and just a spectacular kind of British Columbia scene of the time of a cultural landscape. The dream that someone would have had way back 100 years ago of what freedom looked like, about the promise of British Columbia, and so on and so forth. And I thought at the time that I was doing this watercolor, how will I ever find out about this place? And so this is, as we were discussing, where the web came in and CBC came in. So this, if you clicked on that number 6 on the original key, you would come to a page, part of which looks like this, of these little thumbnails of places that I have gone. And let's say that you are interested in North Bend, that CPR railway community in the Fraser Canyon. Or let's say you might be looking on Google, and what I've put up on this is, yes, it coincided almost exactly with the invention of the Google search engine. You would go to, for example, North Bend, and you would find, as you were looking around, watercolors that I did there over the years. The one on the top left, 1992, and the others were done right around the millennium. But as I began to get information in, and I was looking for information on these particular sites, I looked, of course, through existing archives. This one, City of Vancouver Archives photograph of North Bend in 1885. But people began to send me in photographs from their private collections. So a man who had just been looking for North Bend because he had worked there in the 1970s. And so he sends me this marvelous photograph of the long demolished second CPR hotel in North Bend. So this has been gone now for 40 years, probably. Along the way, I picked up bits of news about places in North Bend. So for example, the Fraser Valley Regional District tried a project to sell off 2 of these CPR railway houses for $1 for anybody who would commit to restoring them, the last ones that were left there. And so far, last time I was up there, update 2019, the house is still boarded up, the offer's still open. But from a social history point of view, what became fascinating was the private collection photographs that came in, and the original set that came in, and this was before the book was published, and so these are in the book, were the photographs of a young woman named Ada Abre, a photograph of her on the bottom right-hand side. And she very much an amateur photographer with a camera, and according to family legend, she would develop film underneath a blanket in her room in the Mountain Hotel that her parents ran. And so included in these extraordinary photographs, a colored brass band. I can't think of a better way of describing these pre-jazz guys who were traveling through Canada at that point. The train stopped there. They got out, played a little bit of a concert in the square, for example. And a few things that you think, you look at a photograph like this, the bar room. This is obviously pre-Prohibition, so we'll say about 1910. And it was Ada Abre's father, Jackson Abre, in that photograph on the bottom left, who was the proprietor of the hotel. And if you have a good historical memory, then you think Abre. There is an Abre section in the Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver. But Jackson Abbray, he was one of the 4 policemen in Vancouver at the time of the Great Fire. And so this famous photograph of City Hall in a tent on the waterfront of Vancouver with the police force arrayed, and that's, of course, great big Jackson Abbray there. So you're beginning to get these layers of social history that are coming in. And Arlana Nicol, who is the granddaughter of Ada Abbray, just began to send in photographs. And with all of these names in it, and of course, these go up on the website, and Google gets in there and does its thing with this. And so anybody who is, for example, looking for Marjorie Balfour would be taken to this place. And I've actually had people who were looking for a specific name come through the millions and millions of web pages right to this page, and then right to me. Included in this extraordinary social history was this story of this young woman, Caroline, in Calcutta, who was hired as a mother's helper, 1914, 1915, 1916, and was raped by the BC provincial policeman at that time. And this was a family story that went down, and I put at the bottom of the webpage at the time, I wonder whether anyone can turn up more detail on this tale. Well, if you go to the webpage today, you will see that in 2017, I was speaking in Chilliwack, and a woman named Judy Downey came up to me and said, "I am Caroline's granddaughter." And so we just came through all of these layers of history to find out about this woman, to find out about the son who was the offspring of this very, very unfortunate event in 1916. And what happened to her son, and then subsequently what happened with the families and so on, and with Caroline. And it's not the happiest tale, as you can imagine, that would come there, but it shows the way that this can work in a kind of a social history way for people looking for genealogy and connecting the dots in their past. Nearby, not too far away from North Bend Spuzzum, just as an example, a couple of watercolors that I painted, the one on the left of the old Spuzzum Hotel, a postcard from the 1940s of the general store and so on. And I received, before the book went to print, from a woman by the name of Charlotte Gioba, information that I didn't know at all. It said that immediately after the Second World War, the Spuzzum Hotel became home to a whole group of Japanese Canadian people who were unable to return to the coast. They had left the actual internment camps in the interior, and they moved into Spuzzum at that period and were there for a number of years. Then years go by, 2019, I get an email from a man named Gregory Butters, who was going through his great-grandfather's photograph collection. And his great-grandfather was an engineer on the Canadian Northern Pacific, which was building on the other side of the Fraser Canyon from the Canadian Pacific. And he sent in a set of extraordinary photographs that I had never seen before, and including one of the Wobbly strike, the IWW strike, that was happening across the river on the CNPR at that time. And according to labor historians Rod Mickelborough and Mark Lair, this is the only photograph that they have ever seen of these workers who are probably under arrest. I'm not sure exactly where they are going to go from there. The details are unclear, but this is them at the Spuzzum station in 1912. So we're getting these kind of layers of stories being filled in. Also included that in that set was a very rare photograph. I've never seen one of the washout of the original Alexandra Bridge in the Fraser Canyon. Now this was washed out in 1894 in the huge flood at that point, and it was the final cut on the Caribou Road. And this is a bridge built by Joseph Trutch, the notorious Joseph Trutch, who figures so largely in Indigenous history in British Columbia. But at the time that he came to British Columbia in the early 1860s, he was an engineer, and he was the one who threw the bridge across the Fraser River at Spuzzum that allowed the Caribou Road to be completed, and then all of that British Columbia history to happen. People sent in great photographs, wonderful photographs that give a sense of the time of traveling up the Fraser Canyon, for example. And a woman quite recently, Susan Marles, who sent in photographs from her father's scrapbook. Doug Willis was an engineer for the Department of Highways in the 1940s and going into the 1950s, in that period where British Columbia is going into the Socred years and beginning to invest money very, very heavily in blacktop politics. And anybody who can remember the Fraser Canyon Highway, and I can only remember it back into the 1950s, but it was a very, very scary thing. And so this is a kind of an indication of what's coming out of the private collections. Just staying on a nearby theme, Alexandra Lodge, a lot of people are familiar with that. The old roadhouse from the 1920s, it has bones of it going back right into the 1860s. Postcard I get from a man in Quebec. I love it. You know, just put that up there. My mother traveled in the dans l'Ouest canadien il y a fort longtemps, a long time ago. And so he sends this in. And just kind of the way that people say, oh, you might know that this is up for sale again. And so we're kind of tracking these things as they go through. What more could be said about Wallachine, that remittance man's community that is along the Thompson River, just past Cache Creek in that very, very arid valley? Well, for the book, I managed to stitch together some interviews and then a BC Archives composite photo and give a bit of annotation to what was going there. And then just after the book was published, 2006, Northern Ireland, a scrapbook of the descendant of Jack Clark, who kept a photo album there in that period. And, you know, not a huge amount of detail in text, but invaluable photographs of what life was like on this little bit of Britain, this little bit of rather aristocratic Britain in the British Columbia interior. Just the clothes of Colonel Flick and REP there, whoever that was on the bottom right-hand side, and the tug of war on Empire Day in 1913. And people who know their BC history will know that a large number of the people in Wallachine enlisted and went and never returned, and the community effectively had collapsed by the end of the First World War. A few more photographs from that scrapbook, including a road trip to Lillooet in 1912. So very, very identifiably Lillooet with the old Victoria Hotel there on the right-hand side. You've also managed to track over the years the loss of places by fire. A province of mainly wooden buildings, and fire is a constant issue for these historic places. So the Beaverdale Hotel, example, just east of Kelowna, in the valley running down to Rock Creek. Sandon, just on the outskirts of Sandon, Tin Cup Annie's. 2008, I get an email with this scan from the Valley Voice newspaper, just giving an indication, this kind of passage of time of what happened there. And another one in Zabalas. So this is west coast of Vancouver Island, getting up to the northern part of the island, and went in there in 2002. And another very, very interesting community, but tracking the fact that the historic Island Hotel burnt down there. And but what became particularly interesting for me was the photographs that were sent in from a man who was a pilot, Charles Ford, and he sent in these quite marvelous, some of them is saturated Kodachrome photographs of that period of air travel going along that. And then, for example, Zabalas, as it flooded, and Zabalas got hit really hard just about that time, or just before that time, by the tsunami that followed the Alaska earthquake. And if you look further on the website, you can see these aerial photographs of places that have just completely disappeared. The outport communities, the places that the Maquina, the old steamship, used to call out in that period. And, you know, for example, the canneries that were up there, CPC, the Nootka Cannery, and so on. And there's really no trace of those, no accessible trace of them left any longer. Not surprising, there would be railway history that would come in, and me kind of starting it out with a little sketch here, Smithers with the railway station there. And all kinds of people sent in information and private collection photographs of the building of the Grand Trunk Pacific. And the various stations that were there along the line. I love this, that's me under the arm of my dad, and I was born in Penny, 1961, so I guess you were born 1955, somewhere in that vicinity. And these little whistle stops that are along the what's now the Canadian National, but the Grand Trunk Pacific route that went out to Prince Rupert. One more here, very evocative of those heavy, heavy snowfalls in the Bulkley Valley, is head out in the Amesbury station. And Robert MacDonald, being a railway historian of some repute. One that I won't go into for reasons of time, but I would urge people to go to the website and look for Colmont and Blakeburn. This is just northwest of Princeton as you go up the Tulameen River. There's an extraordinary amount of information that has come in, largely because of people looking for people to talk to, as it were, who had ancestors who were killed in the mine explosion or survived the mine explosion of August the 13th, 1930. So you go to Blakeburn now and there's absolutely nothing there. There's no place even for the ghosts to live. As you go in the mountains up above Colmont. But the photographs that are there, the old documents from the mine, a lot of these things, and this become particularly poignant because there was some lack of funding for the Princeton Museum that I gather was going to take some of these. And so this idea of how do you curate these things in the 21st century when you have declining amounts of funding going into the small museums, and how do you keep these kinds of collections together? Well, in a very uncurated way. I've been collecting information from people about these communities over the past 20 years, really. I want to wrap up really with a final example of this that I think is one of the most extraordinary stories that came out of it, was finding information on the Japanese Canadian families who spent the war years and right through into the early 1950s in the Shuswap area. Near Tappan. Tappan is about 6 or 7 miles north on the lake from Salmon Arm. And particularly it came around because on Mark's BC Almanac program on CBC, in about 2001, there was a caller who phoned in, a young woman who said that her favorite place in British Columbia was this area called Calhoun Farm, where her mother had been born and her grandparents had lived on a farm during the Second World War years. And particularly, there was only this one place that was left that I found, the Konishi cabin, which is on the Trans-Canada Highway, what is now the Trans-Canada Highway between Carlin and Tappan. Coming out of her mother's collection, out of Kathy Upton's collection, there were these extraordinary photographs that were taken at that time. The little one on the top left, Fumiko Fukuhara, she just died a few years ago, well into her 90s. And her husband, George, born in Vancouver. Fumiko was born on Main Island. So they were Nisei. And with the interviews with them and some of the other survivors, I managed to stitch together a kind of a map of this wartime exile community in the Carlin area, which is very, very near Tappan. And then the material began to flow in, and the Minamamai family was one of the other families who lived there, and they were old friends from the same village in Japan and had lived on the Southlands Flats in Vancouver. That's the photograph on the bottom. The Calhoun family, who were the hosts of these Japanese Canadians on the farm during the Second World War, were equally extraordinary. All I knew about them, and I got a tip that the furniture, including a filing cabinet from the Calhoun estate sale, had gone to Country Store Antiques in Barriere. And I went there in 2003 and managed to find this photograph and a couple of others of the family. And just in that extraordinary coincidence of these things, 5 weeks after I bought the photograph, the store was destroyed in the Barriere Lewis Creek fire of that particular bad summer. But I later managed to find out a little bit more about the family and what had happened, and particularly Alice, who was the daughter who lived on for quite some years after that. But the idea that this family, in the face of a lot of quite racist opposition at that point, took in these Japanese Canadians and helped them build cabins and move their cabins from elsewhere where they had been trying to get themselves established. And they were a little community there that lasted right through into the early 1950s. I thought was quite extraordinary. Then further material comes in from Alfred Hosokawa on Vancouver Island, describing some of the other families who lived in that area at the time. And these are just some photographs of the material that he sent in. And even this very, very detailed maps of what this landscape was like, who the families were, how they worked, how they fitted together. Photographs of the interior of the Tappan School, for example. And there are other things. And with putting these names in, that gradually people are, as they're looking for their ancestors, they're able to find that thanks to that power of the Google search engine. And you can see from this photograph here that the younger generation are getting involved. The granddaughter of Fiko Konishi, who was my correspondent, who actually lived in that, continued. He spent the rest of his life out there, and he just died last year. But he maintained they had a strawberry operation and then a vegetable operation, and then in his old age, he maintained a Christmas tree farm. Just by this old cabin. And then I heard just earlier this year that the cabin had been demolished, that the property had been sold. But this is actually the last physical link, I think, that there is with the people who lived there during that period. The story was so powerful of the Japanese Canadian families that I fictionalized it in a graphic novel called Toshiko. And this, so many of us are doing, we're trying to find new ways of telling these stories to make the history relevant and to make it accessible to young people. The second edition of this has just come out just earlier this month, and I'm delighted to have that, but a story of a kind of a interracial romance, but taking place on the Calhoun farm. So it's fiction, but it's nonfiction, and it ties in with the nonfiction work that I've done on that. I will leave it there. I hope that, that this gives you a little bit of a sense of what's been going on this website and how it's expanded over the last 20 years, and particularly in the last 15 years since the book has come out.
Thank you so much, Michael. I love how one thing leads to another for you and for people who contribute. It's just so rich, and you've added the Vanishing British Columbia book project itself is wonderful, and it's great to pore over, but the way this continues to live on your webpage too, and you're acquiring new information and new insights from people, that's a great thing too. The book is still in print. People can find copies of this book.
The book is in print from your favorite local bookstore who would order it in, or the UBC Press website.
And people can go to your website as well if they're interested in finding out more or contributing as well, and that's on the screen for people too.
That's exactly right, and love hearing from people. there are probably 2 or 3 emails that I get a week from people. Some of them are just general inquiries. Others say, I have photographs of this, or I am writing to respond to people. One thing that I wish I could get a better handle on was Tronquil, the tuberculosis sanatorium. I've had a lot of correspondence from people there who were saying, my grandmother was in there, my mother was in there. Can you give me more information? And I don't know where the information is on that. So I'm just kind of aggregating what's up there and things that people have. But perhaps that can be linked into something that will give people the ability to go and find out what happened to their ancestors who were there.
Yes, and they can go to your website if they want to provide more information. Where will all this live, Michael? You've created an archive here that digitally that contains images and information that you can't find anywhere else.
Well, I don't know. You know, as long as I live, and you know, until I get to my best before date, I guess. It will, you know, I'll keep the thing going, and I'm not sure what will happen after that, but probably I'll begin to look around for some place that could host it, a well-established archive of some form or another that would take it. You know, it's not an enormous website, and very, very simple coding. One of the things that the advantage of when you're not driven by fashion on these things that have tended to keep the coding very simple, so it still works on all of the web platforms, unlike a lot of websites that have become very complex and they're harder to use. But again, I encourage people to take the opportunity just to have a look around it. You know, just follow the serendipity of it. If you have a connection with a particular area, if you know of an area, if you have any information on something, I'm putting up a few news sites that people send in where they've managed to put together a bit of documentation and so on, and we'll continue to do that.
Michael Kluckner, thank you so much. Great to see you again.
Good to see you too, Mark. Thank you.